Hey guys, Aimee and Ernest Langdon here with LTT, and today we're going to talk about finding the gun that's right for you. Personally and professionally, we get the question a lot, what firearm should I buy? Where do I start? Can we talk a little bit about some of the considerations that need to be made before purchasing the firearm once a person has said, I want to buy a firearm, I'm ready to take that next step?
There's a series of considerations. The first one, in my mind, always comes into is like, what is it going to do for you? Is this just something you're going to keep at home? Is this just something I want to go target practice with to get started with? Or is this something I plan on concealed carry and how you're going to carry it? So those are factors you kind of need to know once you're going into it, because all of those factors are important and all of those different firearms do different things for you. I think really here we're talking about more of a personal defense type firearm. So the size of the gun starts to become important for two reasons. How I'm going to carry it, the smaller typically is better as far as concealment goes, but also smaller is not always better when it comes to shootability, how it recoils. Smaller, lighter guns are more difficult to shoot. They kick or recoil a little bit harder. So those are factors that we need to look into.
They're not always easier to conceal necessarily.
That's true.
Just because of some of the lighter, smaller guns that, yes, they feel good and they may seem like they're going to be easier to conceal. Sometimes they're actually harder because they are lighter and more flimsy, and the way that they fit in the holster doesn't allow you to actually conceal it properly.
Correct. That is 100% true. The other factor that comes into play is how the gun fits you, right? So the grip size, like her hand, my hand, right? The gun that fits me, the gun that I can reach the trigger on, is not necessarily the right gun for her or for you. I happen to be a fan of traditional double action guns that have this really long first trigger pull, but I have large hands so I can reach that trigger easily. Other people may not be able to reach that trigger. It just may not even be a proper factor. So when we're talking about double action, the term double means two things are happening at the same time. And that means that when I pull the trigger, I'm actually cocking the hammer to the rear as part of the action. And then when it gets to the rear, it releases and fires the gun. So actually two things happen. I cock it and fire it. Once it goes into the single action mode, the hammer is now fully cocked, and all I'm doing is releasing the hammer from that cocked point, and thus single action, only one action is taking place. A striker fired gun, it's all inside the gun, and there's basically a firing pin that gets pulled to the rear or released from a rearward position when I pull the trigger, and you can't see the hammer or anything firing. Typically, striker fired guns have slightly shorter reaches to the trigger, and they have a consistent same trigger pull every time.
Can we show the reach to the trigger that you were just talking about for hammer fired and double action?
Sure. So in the double action mode, if we look at how far the distance is between the back of the gun here and the front of the trigger, when I grip the gun, reaching to that trigger requires a larger hand than you may have, whereas the striker fired gun, if we look at it, there's a shorter distance between the back of the frame of the gun here and the face of the trigger. So now it requires less reach, you can even see on my hands, to get to that trigger.
I know one of the things that I struggled with when we were going through different guns that I was testing or shooting was finding a gun that I liked size-wise, but also that I could reach because I have short fingers. Sure. And so what works for one person, given a hand size, won't necessarily work for another person because, yeah, you can grip the gun, but if you can't reach that trigger, then it's harder.
Right. And what she's talking about here is if you can't reach this trigger properly because of the size of your hand, and you have to turn your hand and grip the gun improperly, now the gun's not going to work well for you. You're not going to have good recoil control because you're not gripping the gun properly. You're probably not going to have good trigger control either. So when you pick that gun up, just because it feels nice, that's not the only factor that you have to take into consideration when you're trying to make a decision about your purchase.
Yeah, so one of the things that I know I wanted or thought I wanted as I became more comfortable with firearms and I was ready to move into that concealed carry path is I always thought I wanted a smaller gun. I was dead set on wanting a smaller gun. And yes, I like to shoot it, but I actually needed more practice and time behind a gun to feel comfortable shooting a smaller or subcompact gun because of the recoil. The recoil being that when you fire that first round, the gun comes up. I wasn't ready for that, and that's often what takes people by surprise with that first shot.
The reality is what she's talking about is it's a physics issue. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But the lighter the gun, the snappier or the more forceful the recoil is going to be. The heavier the gun, the more it can absorb that recoil. The really small, lightweight gun where it's really easy, it's very light and comfortable to carry possibly, like you said, maybe not as concealable, it can be a much less pleasant gun to shoot. And so a heavier gun is easier to go to the range with and practice with and to shoot well. It's an issue of compromise. You have to decide what will work for you. And just because you go to the gun counter and this one's really light and that's going to be great, that light gun is going to have some surprises for you when you start shooting full power ammo through it.
Yes, that's a good point. When people are going to a gun counter or you're going to look for your first gun, it is important that you go kind of test it out, right? If you don't have an opportunity to test fire it, go feel the gun. Feel what it feels like in your hand. Feel what it feels like from a weight perspective. How does it feel from a grip perspective? Can I get a good solid grip on it with my strong hand and my support hand? Because if it's too big and you can't, then you're gonna have a hard time controlling that gun. But then if it's too small, and you don't have a strong grip, right, that recoil is gonna kick your butt. So my advice would be to go feel it, but also think about it from not only how it feels in your hand, but also the weight perspective. How heavy is this in my hand?
You may have larger hands too. Let's say you do have larger hands and you go to pick a gun up and it's small and you think you can conceal it well, but sometimes the grip can actually be too small. You can't really get a hold of the gun well, and so it jumps around in your hand and you actually have less control. Even though the grip is small and you have big hands, you're like, oh, I have big hands, I'll be fine. You actually have a harder time gripping that really small gun than you would a slightly larger gun that really allows your hands to get better contact on the gun.
Another question we often get is, what caliber gun should I buy? 9mm, 22, 40, 45. Can you tell new shooters a little bit more about what all that means? And then what would you recommend as a good place to start?
There's a lot of information out there about ammunition, but when we start talking about caliber, 9, 40, 45, we're actually talking about the diameter of the bullet, how large the bullet is in diameter. That's the big key that everybody's referring to. And without going down to the rabbit hole of, ballistics and everything else, I would in general, for most people, for defensive purposes, recommend 9mm. And the reason for that is your ability is going to be directly related to your skill level. Skill level is going to be directly related to practice, and 9mm is, for a full power defensive cartridge, is probably the least expensive. It's actually less expensive in most cases than smaller calibers like 380 and 32, which are questionable defensive calibers, but they actually cost more to buy. Whereas 9mm can be purchased relatively cheaply, and it allows you to get more practice in and therefore be more proficient. There's also a wide range of defensive rounds that are loaded in that caliber that work really well. So 9mm is probably the best choice for most people when it comes to choosing a gun and or a defensive round for that gun.
Especially when starting.
Especially when
I
starting.
know the first time that I shot a 40 caliber gun, it shocked the heck out of me because I was not ready for what was coming back just because of the sheer power. So, as a female and a new shooter myself, I would definitely recommend a 9mm for sure.
40 and 45 have significantly more recoil than 9mm, and they do have slightly better terminal performance, but it's not significant enough to make up for the other factors that come into play. And the other thing that's also important to remember is that some of the smaller calibers like 380, they're typically in very small lightweight guns. They actually often recoil more than a similar gun in 9mm.
So there's a couple things that we want you to consider before you go purchase that firearm. And it's going to be the caliber that you want to shoot, the size of the gun, how it feels in your hand weight-wise, how it feels in your hand from the actual object and the size of it. And then what else would be a good first consideration for people that don't have a chance to test fire, but they've made that decision to purchase? Here's what I want to do.
The way the trigger works, the way it functions, and making sure that you can control that trigger well is very important. The sighting system is on the gun is important, being able to see those sights and aim the gun precisely.
You're referring to the rear sight and the front sight.
Correct.
And then whether or not it takes a red dot.
Correct. So those are factors for you to consider. Most guns are going to come with some sort of iron sights on them, and you may be encouraged, or I would encourage you to think of upgrading those sights. Most manufacturers, not all, but most manufacturers keep the sights relatively simple on the gun, and they're a little bit on the plain side, if you will, and they may not be the best sights for you to see all the time because that costs a little more money. So that's a factor for you to look at. And then an electronic sight like this, a red dot sight, really good, allows you to shoot precisely, allows you to target focus and not really worry about the sights as much, but it requires a little bit more training, and there are other considerations like keeping the lens clean, all of those factors. So if you're a beginner shooter, I wouldn't say that you can't go with a red dot, but there's going to be more information you're going to need to know and absorb to be good and proficient with a red dot optic.
So as a beginner shooter or somebody that has made that decision to purchase a firearm and is now going to the gun store to make that purchase, decisions that you want to make and consider before you buy: caliber, size of the gun, how it feels in your hand, weight and grip wise, reach to the trigger, iron sights, red dot sights, the time that is associated there, and then striker fired or hammer fired.
So guys, go out there, do your research, try to make the most smart, informed decision that you can and find out what is right for you.